What do we define as success for Nebraska? In the preseason, I felt like Nebraska had to reach 7-5, 8-4 to have a successful year. The 7-5 depended on circumstances. 8-4, especially 9-3, I viewed as an absolute slam dunk. Like, go 8-4, 9-3, even if you lose by 50 to Ohio State, the season is a success. Given that Nebraska has recently been accustomed to blowout losses against elite teams, and progress for a program is starting with the little things. And the little things are beating Purdue, they're beating Illinois, they're beating Northwestern, beating Iowa, beating the teams that aren't Ohio State, aren't Michigan, aren't Penn State, aren't Oregon. Beat the medium, small, and big teams. Do not go after the giants. Don't try to giant slay when you're in only year 2 of a rebuild. If that happens, awesome. But it is what it is. However, after that Illinois loss, there was this massive wave of pessimism over the Nebraska fan base, where it felt like, and Corn Crazed sort of alluded to this in a live reaction of his immediately following the Nebraska-Illinois game, that it felt like people were disappointed that now 10-2 did not seem possible for Nebraska, and that the season was, in some sense, going to be a failure. Well, that's, I don't know, kind of ridiculous in my mind. Yeah, the loss to Illinois was disappointing because Nebraska's team quit. They were out-physicaled. They were outmanned. Honestly, Nebraska looked like a Big 12 ACC school with great quarterback play, great receiver talent, and a lot of finesse, but not much physicality to back it up. At least what we knew the Big 12 to be, what we knew it to be when, Bob Stoops and Lincoln Riley were coaching there and the offenses were high-flying. Now, with Oklahoma and Texas gone, and Kansas State and Utah, and even, Kansas and West Virginia and Iowa State being in the thick of it, it's now known to be one of the more physical conferences in college football. But from what we've known the Big 12 to historically be, and what I think the ACC is now, that's what Nebraska looked like. One of those teams that has finesse, that has hype, that has athletes, but when you counterpunch them and when you hang around, they run a high risk of breaking. And they broke. You saw that in overtime when Raiola was nearly sacked like 4 times in a row. You saw that. But with how that loss was and how it hurt Nebraska, and it should have hurt, Nebraska's not going to be 7-0 entering the Ohio State game, and they could be 5-2, 4-3 entering that game with Rutgers and Indiana up on the chopping block. But they could also be 6-1, and Rutgers, I tell you, is probably better than Wisconsin, definitely better than Purdue, could be better than UCLA, probably is, and Nebraska's not going to be viewed as more than a touchdown underdog in any of their remaining games outside of against Ohio State, more likely than not. What I define success for Nebraska as is going 7-5, 8-4. 7-5 depending on the circumstances. Otherwise, it's just kind of like, okay, you kind of did the bare minimum to not have a disappointing year. 6-6 would be the epitome of that. If anything, 6-6 would be disappointing because the schedule's basically the same as it was last year, and you only win one additional game. It's basically saying, congratulations, you choked one less game than you did last year. 6-6 is not successful. 7-5, it depends. It could be successful. It also could be not. 8-4 is definitely successful. And the remaining top 25 opponents for the Cornhuskers are number 3 Ohio State and number 13 USC. That's it. That is it. Those are the remaining teams that are ranked on Nebraska's schedule. That's what remains. So you look here, and I'll show you the whole schedule for the Cornhuskers. You look at road trip to USC. Going to be tough, but it's winnable. The only game that really isn't winnable is that road trip to Ohio State. And Nebraska may be competitive in that game if they can get their trench play figured out, but that's a big if. At Purdue, this coming weekend, September 28th, Nebraska is a 10-point favorite, double-digit favorite on the road at Purdue, a team who just lost to Notre Dame by 59 points. They host Rutgers October 5th, winnable game. Have a bye, then they travel to Indiana before traveling to Ohio State. That is a winnable game. Ohio State is on October 26th. UCLA is a home game on November 2nd. Nebraska's a bye, and then they travel to USC November 16th. They host Wisconsin November 23rd. And they play at Iowa in a night game for the Heroes Trophy on Friday, November 29th, which I think could still be a ranked matchup. Not a guarantee, but it could be. Because there is a world where Nebraska beats Purdue, Rutgers, and Indiana. They enter Ohio State 6-1. At that point, they're probably ranked 6-2 after Ohio State, 7-2 against UCLA. Let's say they split USC and Wisconsin. They're 8-3 entering Iowa with a win over, Rutgers, Indiana, could beat USC or Wisconsin, and then playing Iowa, there's a good chance 8-3 Nebraska is ranked. They're probably definitely ranked. And then Iowa, I think, is going to win the remainder of their games outside of Ohio State, entering that Nebraska game, which will be their next toughest game. They'll be 9-2 entering the Heroes game. So what I define as success for Nebraska is pretty simple. 7-5, 8-4, 9-3. I no longer think 10-2 is possible because Ohio State, starting with Ohio State and then through the rest of the year, I thought that Ohio State would beat them, obviously, and then one other team would beat the Cornhuskers in that stretch, that 5-game stretch. And right now I would say the most likely losses are Ohio State on the road, obviously, and then I would say Iowa. I think that Nebraska actually has a trench advantage over USC. They absolutely do not have a trench advantage over Iowa, who, from what I can tell, is even better trench play than Illinois, and a better defense. And it's on the road at night, not at home at night. So a big point swing in home field advantage, and I think Iowa and power rankings would agree with me is also a better team than Illinois overall. That's what I define as success. Not reaching the playoff, not necessarily finishing ranked, just getting really eight wins, I would say. So 7-5, if you win your bowl game, or if the schedule turns out to be tougher than was previously thought and you beat a good team, then that can be successful. 9 wins no matter what is definitely successful. The Cornhuskers, what's held them back so far this season, mainly against Illinois, but you saw it a little bit against Northern Iowa, is they're not elite yet on the lines of scrimmage. And no one's saying they have to be. It's in year 2 of a rebuild where after the Scott Frost era, it was very clear that Nebraska lacked in the trenches. That was Frost's weakness at Nebraska, was his offensive lines were constantly in the bottom of the Big Ten. So far this season, Nebraska's 562 rushing yards. They average 4.1 yards per carry. They've allowed 6 sacks. They allow their opponents to run for 79.3 yards per game. And they allow their opponents to run for 2.8 yards per carry. And they have not faced an elite rush offense or anything close to it. They have not even faced an elite offensive line. Illinois' offensive line is good. It's probably not even great. Good. Better than it was last year. But the reason Illinois beat Nebraska more so had to do with the fact that they have a near-elite great wide receiver room, specifically Pat Bryant and Zachary Franklin, and a quarterback in Luke Altmaier who looks like he's in the top third of Big Ten QBs so far this year, especially in terms of efficiency. Only averaging a little over 100 rushing yards per game, about 4 yards per carry, allowing 6 sacks, most of them against Illinois, who had by far the best defense Nebraska's played all season long. That is not good. That's worrying. And you know that Nebraska is inflated. They're inflated in their rushing offense and rushing defense because they played Colorado, who can't stop the run, nor can they effectively run the football at all. They're one of the worst Power 4 teams when you look at trench play. Now, to their credit, they're pretty good at the skill positions, but skill positions are more inclined to rely on trench play than trench play relies on skill positions. More inclined to do so, at least. There are exceptions to that. But the Nebraska-Colorado game was an example where, because Shedeur Sanders had no time and he doesn't like to get the ball out quickly, that resulted in a disaster where Colorado's passing offense could never get going. And I think that game gave, even for me, a little bit of a mirage. I predicted Nebraska to dominate Colorado, but that was maybe a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy because I also thought they would game control Illinois and win by double digits. And instead, they lost 31-24 in overtime. And a lot of this has to do with trench play. And the fact that I believe last year, Nebraska, outside of Michigan and Wisconsin, played no one who could effectively run the football. Illinois has a better offensive line and perhaps better line of scrimmage overall than 10 out of the 12 teams Nebraska played last year. And I would say the same thing about Rutgers, obviously Ohio State, obviously this year's edition of Iowa, maybe even this year's Wisconsin, maybe USC, maybe Indiana. The lines of scrimmage that Nebraska is playing this year, mostly because they're no longer in the Big Ten West, but also because a lot of bad Big Ten schools from last year made progress and upgraded. There's a lot more parity in the Big Ten right now outside of Ohio State and maybe Penn State and Oregon, who are clearly the top three. There's a lot more parity. So Nebraska's going to be facing much tougher trench play on average than they did last year. While they lost their two starting linebackers from last year, they have some injury concerns on the offensive line. Their offensive linemen are only in year 2 of the system after being horrifically developed by the prior regime under Scott Frost. And the defensive line is a 3-man front. It is a 3-3-5, which is meant to counter the spread, not meant to stop power running or a pro spread offense that can power run. So there are areas with questions for Nebraska in the trenches, and also a little bit schematically to where you wonder if Nebraska, schematically, they're way more prepared for the Big Ten than they were under Frost, but are there some things that they can do schematically extra that can help them further in Big Ten play? Regardless, I still think this is a good team. They're definitely going bowling in my mind. And I think that they're building towards something better, much like USC is, where next year they'll be a legitimate Big Ten contender. Thank you to my Patreon members for sponsoring this video and channel. I want to give a shout out to Crash2488 and Brasco Rascal for being Heisman Patreon members at $25 a month. If you sign up as a Heisman for 6 months at $25 a month, you will get signed free College Football with Sam merchandise of your choice delivered to you, plus access to my weekly college football picks, straight up and also against the spread. You get access to the picks, just not the signed merchandise if you're an All-American member at $10 a month. Thanks to Chris Slayton, kind of little OH, Ismar, Tyler Nye, and Chilton Cush for being All-American members. And if you just want your name featured at the end of every video with a shout-out, sign up as an All-Conference member for $5 a month. Thank you, John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Steele, Austin Christmas, and Janaisha Cockrell for being all-conference members. The links to my merchandise store and my Patreon page, both ways to support the channel, are in the description and also down below in the pinned comment. And I also encourage you to join my Discord via the link in the description and also in the pinned comment. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you all soon. Bye-bye.